Welcome back everybody to my PowerShell course brought to you by Avexta. In continuing with trying to get to the point of data structures, there's a lot of bridges in between the objects and data structures. And the reason why I like to include this extra lessons on loops and ifs and switch is that if we get to data structures, you're just going to see code that is not going to make sense. And that's why I want to go over the looping and the fundamentals of PowerShell, and not only PowerShell, but just in terms of programming. So let's take a look. So PowerShell has pretest loops and posttest loops. So what do we mean by that? What we mean is that a pretest loop is actually going to first check the condition in the loop syntax, and if that condition is true, then it's gonna enter the body. If that condition is false, then it will not execute the body and not iterate. Now, why is it pretest? It's a pretest because it checks the condition first, meaning that there's a possibility that when your code gets to that loop and that first condition, the first time that it enters your code in that loop is false, then the body may not execute at all, or it won't execute at all. Whereas if you have a post-test loop, the code is built in such a way that it will at least execute once. It'll execute once and then do the test of the condition after. And that's why it's called post-test, because it does the execution of the body first and then the condition check. Now PowerShell has a couple of loops available to us, which we're going to take a closer look in these lessons. I'm going to go over the for loop, the for each, the while, which are all examples of pretest loops. And then it also has post-test loops, which are the do while and the do until. Every loop in PowerShell is going to have its own syntax rules, and we're going to take a look at that in these lessons. Now, a lot of beginning programmers in general, but maybe some of you do have experience, my take on deciding on which loop do you want to use, I think it starts with, do you want to do a pretest or a post-test? Meaning that, are you going to allow this block of code to execute at least once? If you want it to execute at least once, meaning no matter what, you just want it to execute once, then you want to go, I think you want to go with a post-test. But if you have a condition or specification that perhaps based on something you may never want to enter the loop, then you want to do a pretest. Once that decision is made, then you can choose the loop that you feel most comfortable with. So for example, if you know that you have a pretest type of logic that you need to do, then my preference is the for loop. I don't generally like to go too much with a while loop. I just like the for loop because it's more robust. Now, that's not to say that if I was looking at, for example, in C#, going through a database record set and going through a data reader, then that's a pretest, and then I'd probably want to use a while loop. So again, it all depends on your preference, and certain languages lend themselves to use a certain loop for certain things that you want to do, much like the database connection and that. Okay, so let's get started. Let's look at the syntax. I'm going to start with pretest first, give you a couple of examples of how that works, and then I'll go into post-test. Looking at some code here, we can see that the syntax that we have with a for loop, again, pretest loop, and I'm going to show you how the syntax works. So the for loop is going to have three parts. The first part is going to be your initialization part. Basically, where do you want to start? Where do you want to start your loop? Usually you initialize a variable equal to 0, and that would be your first point of entry. Now, this initialization step is only going to execute once. Once you enter this logic here and you go into this loop, just keep note that the init step will only execute once. And so your initialization, once you initialize it, that's it. That's all you get. You don't get anything more. You can never go back to this step. The next step is the actual condition. This is what is actually going to either keep you in the loop or boot you out of the loop. This condition is going to be a Boolean condition. You learned about different relational and logical operators. So what you'd have here is some type of relational or logical expression where if it's true, then it will enter the body of the loop. If it's false, then it will never see the light of day of the body of the loop, and it'll just break out of the loop. You gotta, again, because it's a pretest, you could have a instance where, yes, you have your initialization, I equals 0. Your condition, because it checks a condition right after this, if it's false, then you'll never enter your loop at all. And that's why they call it pretest. And if you're keeping order of how this works, is initialization first and then the condition. Once the condition, for this simplicity's sake, is true, then we start executing whatever is in the for loop compound statement. This will execute once and then come back once you see all the PowerShell commands and it executes all the PowerShell commands. It's going to come back up to this here, and it's going to come back up to the repeat step. The repeat step is actually a step that you will use to increment our loop variable. We can call this a control variable, because your condition must eventually break out. You don't want to stay in the loop forever. So what this repeat statement does is it allows you to increment your control variable so that eventually, it doesn't have to be on the first iteration, eventually your condition will be false, and then we can come out of this loop. Notice that once we increment, or it could be a decrement as well, you can do remove one out of the value. You always go back to the condition based on what the condition is. If it's a true or false, if it's true, then we continue for the next iteration inside the compound statement here, and then come back all the way up to the repeat step again. It's going to be either an increment or a decrement, and then come back to the condition. When you're toggling back and forth, always remember that when you execute the body of the compound statement in your iteration, when I say iteration, I mean in that turn where it's executing these PowerShell statements, and it comes back up. When it comes back up, it's never going to check the condition first. It's always going to go into the repeat step. Repeat step, and then check the condition. And that will allow us to either stay in the loop or come out of the loop. Now, let's be a little more specific and cook up an example. Here is the syntax for the for loop. It's straight up for loop. This is my initialization. When I come in here, I will initialize I to 0. Then I am going to say that I is less than 10. So this is my condition. This is what's going to keep me in the loop if it's true, and if it's not, then I'm just going to come out. On the first time that we enter here, let's do a walkthrough. So we execute this first, then we compare. Is I less than 10? Yes, I is 0 is less than 10. We're going to execute the body. There's no more statements here, so we're going to come back up. When we come back up, we're going to increment I by 1. So I went from 0 to 1, and then remember, we're going to toggle back to the condition. When if I is less than 10, is I less than 10? Yes. It's going to stay in, we're going to execute the compound statement here, and then this will print out 1. Then it'll eventually go all the way up to 9. When I is 9, it's going to come back up and then increment this by 1. When this increments by 1, we now have 10. Is 10 less than 10? That's false, so it's going to come back out and not execute again. So if I do that and I run this, you'll see that it goes all the way up to 9. All right, starts at 0, 1, 2. So my statement of the for loop, the body of my for loop is going to execute over and over and over again. So I hope that shed a little light on in terms of the syntax. Now, there's a couple of things, little caveats here and there that you could do with PowerShell. You could have 2 initialization variables. That's perfectly okay. Meaning that I can do I is equal to 0 and let's say j is equal to 0. I can do that. I can do that. I can have a relational condition here, a logical condition. I could have that as well. And then the increment, I can also have more than one repeat statement for an increment variable. This I could do I++, or I could do also j++ if I wanted to. So you can get really fancy if you want to, if you need it. To tell you the truth, I've never had the need to have multiple increments, but again, it all depends on how clean your code is and how complex you want to get things. I think simple is best, and I try not to segue out of that. The other thing you can do is, I don't necessarily have to do an increment operator here. I can add this. I can add whatever number I want. But for me to do that, if I'm not going to add by 1 or subtract by 1, meaning I'm not going to do I minus minus, what I need to do is I can also say I is equal to I plus 2. And what that does is it's going to increment I instead of by 1. It's going to increment by 2. Still going to toggle back to my condition here, less than 10, except you're going to see a little bit of a difference. So it starts at 0, right? Then you're going to do 2, 4, 6, and 8. And then when it eventually gets to 8, it's going to come back up, increment by 2, but then this eventually will become false. One other thing I want to mention about loops, and because it is a command shell, it's not formal programming language. The terminology, when you hear somebody say scope of a variable, if we were doing some high-level programming language such as C# or C++, the scope of this I exists within this loop and only this loop. That's not true for PowerShell. For PowerShell, if I do that, the following, the value of I will persist after this loop. Even though it's only initialized here, you will see that if I run this, it says what happened to I. It now becomes, it is 10 because the last iteration incremented by 10, and it jumped out of this loop. So be careful when you're doing loops as well, and you're reusing some type of loop control variables. You may want to reinitialize them back to 0 after the loop terminates, just to make sure. Okay, That does it for loops, and next video I'm going to talk about for each.